This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The quiet question I avoid. When I'm alone, I want to start with a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No tears on the bathroom floor, no crisis call at midnight. Just me, alone, in a quiet room, asking a question I've learned to avoid. The question isn't, what's wrong with my life? It's much more unsettling than that. The question is, if no one needed anything from me right now, who would I be? That question doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in late at night, when the house finally exhales, when the dishes are done, when the emails are unanswered but no longer urgent, when my phone is face down and the world has stopped asking me to perform competence, patience, or strength. That's when I feel it, the subtle sense that I am standing in the middle of something I can't name. I'm not unhappy. That's the part that makes this confusing. I'm not falling apart. I still show up. I still function. I still do what needs to be done. But there's a quiet hollowness that doesn't respond to gratitude lists or positive reframes, a low-grade ache that isn't pain exactly. It's more like absence, like a room in me that used to be occupied, now echoing. And the strangest part? No one around me seems to notice. From the outside, my life reads as stable, respectable, even successful depending on who's looking. I live in the United States, move through my days with a practiced sense of responsibility. I keep my commitments. I pay my bills. I remember birthdays. I meet deadlines. I am the woman people describe as strong without thinking twice about what that word costs. I've become very good at being fine. So good, in fact, that even I started to believe it. But late at night, when no one is watching, I realize how much energy it takes to maintain that version of myself, how much of my life has been built around not needing, not asking, not pausing long enough to feel what's underneath the surface. This is the part no one prepares you for, not the big heartbreaks, not the obvious failures. It's the quiet erosion that happens when you live too long in I'm okay mode, when you learn to manage discomfort instead of listening to it, when you confuse endurance with peace, when you mistake being needed for being alive. Somewhere along the way, and I stopped asking myself honest questions because I was afraid of the answers, afraid that if I looked too closely, something would fall apart, or worse, nothing would. And I'd have to admit that this numb, muted middle was something I had chosen by default. The truth is, I've been carrying things for years that don't show up in conversation, not because they're dramatic, but because they're inconvenient. Old choices I never revisited, versions of myself I quietly abandoned to survive, moments when I knew what I wanted and talked myself out of it with very reasonable explanations. I don't talk about those moments much, not because they're shameful, but because they don't fit neatly into the story of a woman who has it together, and yet they live in me. They show up in the way I hesitate before saying no, in the way I second-guess my own knowing, in the way rest feels undeserved instead of natural. This is where the real question begins to take shape, not, why did this happen to me? But what am I still holding myself hostage for? I used to think forgiveness was something you offered other people, a moral high ground, a spiritual achievement, something noble. No one told me about the kind of forgiveness that happens in private, the kind that doesn't come with closure or reconciliation, the kind that looks like quietly setting down a burden you've been carrying so long you forgot it was optional. What if the weight I feel isn't because life has been unkind, but because I've been living with a constant low-level self-accusation? What if the exhaustion isn't from doing too much, but from carrying too many versions of who I thought I should be? And these are not questions that demand immediate answers. They ask for something far more uncomfortable, honesty, without urgency. And that's hard in a culture that rewards motion, that applauds productivity, that teaches women especially to keep going, keep contributing, keep smiling, keep it together. We are praised for our resilience long before anyone asks whether we're still connected to ourselves. If any part of this feels familiar, if you're listening and thinking, yes, that's me, but I don't know how to say it out loud, then you are exactly where this conversation begins, not at rock bottom, not at a breakthrough, but in the middle. Before we go any further, I want to pause here. If this kind of quiet, honest conversation resonates with you, if you want more reflections that don't rush you, fix you, and or talk over your experience, please subscribe to this channel. Your support tells me this work matters, and it gives me the space to keep creating videos for women who don't need hype. They need truth. Because what we're about to talk about isn't about becoming someone new. It's about meeting the woman you've been carrying silently for years and deciding whether you're finally ready to stop asking her to disappear. And that question? And that's the one I avoided for a very long time, until I couldn't anymore. When strength becomes a costume, there was a time when strength felt like something alive inside me. It rose naturally, without effort, without calculation. I didn't think about it. I didn't manage it. It wasn't a strategy. It was simply who I was in motion. Somewhere along the way, that changed. And strength stopped being an internal resource and slowly turned into an external expectation. It became something I was recognized for, praised for, depended on for. And once something becomes useful to others, it rarely remains free. I didn't notice the shift at first. These things never announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as compliments. You're so strong. I don't know how you do it. You always handle things so well. At first, those words felt affirming. Later, they became instructions. I learned what people needed me to be, and I learned how to deliver it consistently. Calm, capable, steady. I learned how to absorb chaos without showing strain. I learned how to solve problems without revealing how much they cost me. I learned how to stay upright even when something inside me wanted to sit down or stop altogether. And that's how strength became a costume, a well-tailored one, polished, reliable, appropriate for every room I walked into. I wore it to work, where emotional containment is often mistaken for professionalism. I wore it in relationships, where being low maintenance was quietly rewarded. I wore it in family dynamics, where being the dependable one meant I was rarely asked how I was actually doing, and the longer I wore it, the harder it became to take off. Because once people are used to you being strong, they don't recognize you without it. And eventually, you don't either. What no one talks about is how exhausting it is to live as an emotional constant, to be the steady presence while your inner weather shifts unnoticed, to hold space for others while your own interior life goes largely unvisited. I didn't collapse. I didn't unravel. I just slowly learned how to minimize myself emotionally while remaining fully functional. That's the version of strength that doesn't look like pain, but feels like disconnection. I started managing my feelings instead of experiencing them, editing my reactions so they would remain socially acceptable, translating what I felt into something easier to digest. Over time, I stopped asking myself what was true and started asking what was reasonable. And reasonable women are very easy to live with. But they are not always at home in themselves. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being perceived as strong. People assume you don't need checking in on. They assume silence means stability. They assume your composure is proof that everything is fine. I learned how to carry uncertainty quietly, how to swallow disappointment without naming it, how to stay composed even when something inside me felt off-center. not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because vulnerability felt impractical. There was always something to do, someone to support, a role to fulfill. Strength became synonymous with usefulness, and usefulness became my permission to exist. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was slowly outsourcing my inner authority. The more I adapted to external expectations, the less fluent I became in my own emotional language. I didn't ask myself what I needed. I asked myself what was required. And over time, that question became automatic. This is the part that's hard to admit. I was rewarded for my disconnection. The world works well for women who don't disrupt its rhythm with too much truth. Women who manage themselves efficiently. Women who don't leak emotion in public spaces. There is a subtle pride that comes with that, a sense of being in control, of being respected. But control is not the same as wholeness, and respect does not always come with intimacy. At some point, I realized that my strength had stopped protecting me and started concealing me. It hid my fatigue, it hid my doubt, it hid the parts of me that were still asking questions I didn't have time to answer. I wasn't lying to anyone. I was just selectively revealing. The cost of that kind of living is cumulative. It doesn't announce itself as burnout or breakdown. It shows up as emotional flatness, as the inability to feel deeply, either joy or sorrow, as a vague sense that something essential has gone quiet. I could still perform competence. I could still offer support. I could still lead and manage and respond, but I couldn't always tell what I felt without thinking about it first. That's when I knew something had shifted. Strength, when it's real, is responsive. It moves. It breathes. It adapts. But a costume is rigid. It doesn't expand. It doesn't soften. It only holds its shape. And I had been holding mine for a very long time. The truth is, no one explicitly asked me to live this way. I absorbed it through observation, through cultural cues, through unspoken rules about what it means to be a capable woman in a world that prefers us reliable over reflective. I internalized the idea that softness was a liability, that pausing meant falling behind, that asking for support meant I had mismanaged something, so I stayed ahead of my own needs. But strength without softness eventually becomes brittle. It looks solid, but it doesn't bend. And anything that can't bend eventually breaks, or goes numb to avoid breaking. I don't think the answer is to abandon strength. I think the work is to reclaim it from performance, to let strength come back inside where it belongs, to allow it to coexist with uncertainty, to let it include rest, hesitation, and emotional truth. I'm learning that real strength isn't about how much I can carry without flinching. It's about how honestly I can respond to what's happening inside me, even when it doesn't match the version of myself others are used to. That's not a transformation that happens overnight. It's a slow unlearning, a careful removal of layers, a willingness to disappoint expectations I never consciously agreed to. But it begins with one quiet recognition. I am allowed to be strong without being armored, and I don't have to keep wearing a version of myself that no longer fits. Meeting a woman who didn't ask me to be better. I didn't go looking for her. That feels important to say, because so many meaningful encounters are misunderstood as destiny when, in reality, they happen because we are finally quiet enough to notice what's already been circling us. I first saw her through a screen, months before I ever sat in the same room with her. I wasn't searching for guidance. I wasn't in crisis. I was scrolling absent-mindedly, the way people do when they're tired but not ready to sleep. Her face appeared briefly, framed by calm, not charisma, no dramatic music, no urgent promise of change. just a woman speaking as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. I didn't stop because she said something brilliant. I stopped because she didn't rush. There was a quality to her presence that felt unfamiliar, not impressive, unprotected. She spoke slowly, not because she was choosing her words carefully, but because she trusted silence to carry some of the weight. I realized how rarely I allow that in my own life, how often I fill space so no one mistakes my pause for uncertainty. I kept listening. She wasn't telling anyone how to fix themselves. She wasn't diagnosing pain or offering steps. She wasn't framing struggle as a problem to solve. Instead, she asked questions that felt almost intrusive in their simplicity. Questions most people avoid because they don't produce quick answers. Weeks later, I found myself in Sedona, Arizona, surrounded by red rock formations that looked older than language. The air felt different there, thin, quiet, indifferent to human urgency. The gathering was small, intentionally so. No stage lights, no hierarchy, just chairs arranged in a way that suggested conversation, not performance. When she walked into the room, nothing shifted outwardly, no applause, no announcement. And yet, something in me went alert. She sat the way someone sits when they are fully inside themselves, not guarded, not exposed, just present. That kind of presence is rare, and it does something to people. It makes pretense feel unnecessary, almost embarrassing. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself saying things I hadn't rehearsed, not because I felt brave, but because she wasn't pulling anything out of me. She wasn't leaning forward, waiting for a breakthrough moment. She wasn't nodding at the right places. She was listening without agenda. At one point, she looked at me, not with concern, not with curiosity, but with recognition, and asked, "What are you still holding yourself accountable for?" Not what are you healing from, not what hurt you, not what do you want to change. What are you still holding yourself accountable for? The question landed with a weight I didn't expect, because I knew immediately what she wasn't asking. She wasn't asking about responsibility. She was asking about punishment. I felt my body react before my mind did, a tightening in my chest, a pause in my breath, that familiar instinct to reframe, to intellectualize, to offer something thoughtful but safe. She didn't interrupt the silence that followed. She didn't rescue me from it. And that's when I understood something quietly but clearly. Most of the people I've encountered in spaces like this are invested in progress. She was invested in truth. There is a difference. Progress wants movement. Truth wants contact. She wasn't interested in who I was becoming. She was interested in who I had stopped allowing myself to be. That distinction matters, especially for women who are accustomed to constant self-improvement, disguised as virtue. I realized how many conversations I've had where the unspoken goal was elevation, be better, think higher, heal faster. Those conversations can be useful, but they often bypass something essential. They skip over grief. They skip over regret. They skip over the quiet self-reproach that lives beneath polished narratives. She didn't. She didn't validate my story or challenge it. She didn't correct my perspective or affirm my strength. She didn't offer language that made me feel empowered or inspired. She offered space, and space, when you're not used to it, can feel unsettling. I noticed how quickly I wanted to fill it, how uncomfortable it felt to sit without explaining myself, how deeply ingrained my instinct was to make sense of my life out loud, to present it in a way that sounded coherent and justified. She let that impulse pass. What struck me most was what she didn't do. She didn't frame my experiences as lessons yet. She didn't repackage my pain into meaning. She didn't rush me toward insight. She treated my inner world as something worthy of patience. That alone shifted something, because for so long I had treated my own inner life like a project with deadlines, something to work through efficiently, on something to resolve so I could move on. Sitting across from her, I felt the unfamiliar sensation of not being asked to move anywhere, not forward, not upward, not out of myself, just here. It became clear to me that much of what I called healing in the past was actually negotiation. I was constantly bargaining with my own pain, acknowledging it just enough to justify leaving it behind. She wasn't interested in negotiation. She was interested in what happens when you stop trying to earn your way out of your own humanity. When the gathering ended, there was no climactic ending, no final takeaway, no moment where everything clicked into place. That would have been easier, in a way. Instead, I left with a question that stayed open. And I realized that was the point. Some people enter your life to give you answers. Others enter to disrupt the questions you've been asking. She was the second kind. In the days that followed, her presence stayed with me, not as a voice telling me what to do, but as a mirror I hadn't realized I was avoiding. I noticed how often I spoke to myself in the language of assessment, how rarely I spoke in the language of allowance. Meeting her didn't make my life clearer. It made it more honest. And that honesty didn't feel liberating at first. It felt exposed, unfinished, slightly raw, but it also felt real. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about who I needed to become. I was paying attention to who I already was, without editing, without urgency, without performance. She didn't ask me to be better. She asked me to be here. And that changed the direction of everything that followed, and the kind of forgiveness. No one talks about forgiveness is one of those words that sounds gentle until you actually try to live it. I grew up hearing it framed as something clean and virtuous. You forgive and move on. You forgive because it's the right thing to do. You forgive to free yourself. The language around it was always polished, always elevated, as if forgiveness happened in a single, decisive moment, like a door closing softly behind you. But the kind of forgiveness I had to face wasn't soft, and it certainly wasn't simple. No one ever told me about the forgiveness that has nothing to do with other people, the forgiveness that happens alone, without witnesses, without reconciliation, without relief. The forgiveness that doesn't come with peace right away. This is the kind no one talks about. And I didn't need to forgive someone who betrayed me or disappointed me. I had already done that work, at least on the surface. I knew how to name harm. I knew how to draw conclusions. I knew how to say, I did the best I could. What I hadn't done was forgive myself for the ways I participated in my own suffering. Not because I was weak, but because I was afraid. There are choices I made that still sit quietly in me, not loudly enough to demand attention, but persistently enough to shape how I see myself. Staying longer than I knew I should. Leaving when staying would have required a different kind of courage. Choosing safety when my body was asking for truth. Choosing love when I should have chosen myself. I don't dramatize those moments anymore. I don't spiral into shame, but I also didn't release them. Instead, I kept a quiet ledger and a mental list of evidence against myself. I didn't consciously punish myself for those decisions. I just limited myself afterward. I second-guessed my instincts. I hesitated when opportunities appeared. I made myself smaller in subtle ways, as if some internal authority had decided I needed to earn my confidence back. This is what self-forgiveness looks like when it's absent. It doesn't scream, it constricts. I didn't wake up thinking, I don't deserve ease. I just didn't let myself have it. I didn't say, I failed. I just stayed vigilant, as if something might go wrong if I relaxed. The kind of forgiveness no one talks about is not about saying, "It's okay." It's about saying, "I understand." Understanding the version of myself who didn't know yet. Understanding the version of myself who was surviving on partial information. And understanding the version of myself who made decisions under pressure, fear, hope, or exhaustion. Forgiveness didn't come as a wave of compassion. It came as a slow dismantling of the case I had built against myself. I had to look at my life without rewriting it. That was the hardest part. I didn't want to excuse everything. I didn't want to spiritualize my mistakes or turn them into neat lessons prematurely. I needed to see them clearly, without cruelty and without romance. I had to admit that some of my choices came from avoidance. Some came from longing. Some came from the belief that enduring discomfort was the same as being mature. And some came from love, even when love cost me more than it should have. Forgiving myself meant acknowledging that I wasn't careless. I was human. That I wasn't reckless. I was responding to the conditions of my life at the time. That I wasn't broken. I was learning in real time, without a script. This kind of forgiveness doesn't absolve responsibility. It changes the relationship to it. Instead of asking, "How could I have done that?" I began asking, "What did I believe then that I no longer believe now?" That shift matters, because it allows growth without self-erasure. I noticed how much of my internal dialogue was rooted in hindsight, judging past decisions with present awareness, expecting an earlier version of myself to have knowledge she didn't yet possess. That's not wisdom. That's unfairness. Forgiveness required me to release the illusion that I should have known better, to accept that knowing better comes from living, not from foresight. And I also had to confront how much I equated forgiveness with reconciliation, with closure, with everything feeling resolved. But self-forgiveness doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels neutral. Sometimes it feels anticlimactic. Sometimes it feels like grief, because letting go of blame means letting go of a familiar identity, the identity of the woman who is still paying for something. There was a strange comfort in holding myself accountable indefinitely. It gave my pain structure. It gave my restraint meaning. It allowed me to believe I was being disciplined, not afraid. Forgiving myself meant stepping into uncertainty. What happens when I stop punishing myself quietly? What happens when I let myself trust again? What happens when I allow ease without justification? Those questions felt riskier than staying guarded. And the forgiveness no one talks about is not a declaration. It's a practice. It's choosing, again and again, not to revisit the same internal courtroom. It's noticing when the old narrative resurfaces and gently refusing to prosecute. It's allowing joy without suspicion, rest without guilt, confidence without conditions. I'm still learning how to do this. There are days when old self-judgments appear uninvited, when I feel the reflex to tighten, to evaluate, to hold myself to account for things long past. But now, I recognize that reflex for what it is, not truth, but habit, and habits can be interrupted. Forgiving myself hasn't made me softer in the way I expected. It has made me steadier, less reactive, less invested in proving that I've learned enough to deserve peace. Peace, I'm realizing, isn't a reward. It's a posture. And the moment I stopped treating forgiveness as something I had to earn, it began to take root, not as relief, but as space. Space to live without constant self-surveillance. Space to trust my present choices without anchoring them to past ones. Space to be a woman in motion, not a verdict waiting to be overturned. This is the forgiveness no one applauds, the forgiveness that doesn't announce itself. the forgiveness that simply loosens the grip and lets you breathe again, quietly, honestly, without asking permission. The difference between a wound and a lesson. For a long time, I called everything that hurt a wound. It felt honest at first, accurate even. Naming pain as a wound gave me language for what lingered. It explained why certain memories still tightened my chest, why some conversations drained me more than others, and why certain patterns kept repeating even after I thought I had moved on. A wound sounded legitimate. It sounded like something that deserved care. But over time, I began to notice what that word was doing to me. A wound implies something open, something fragile, something that needs protection. And the longer I carried that language, the more I organized my life around not being touched in the wrong places. I avoided certain risks. I hesitated before trusting my instincts. I framed my history as evidence of damage rather than experience. I didn't realize it then, but calling everything a wound was quietly shaping my identity. I wasn't just a woman who had been hurt. I was a woman who was hurt. There's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. A wound asks for caution. A lesson asks for integration. When I finally started paying attention to that distinction, it wasn't because I wanted to be more positive or resilient. It was because I was tired of living as if my past were something I had to constantly defend myself against. Somewhere along the way, I had confused honoring my experiences with preserving my pain. I told myself I was being truthful by staying close to my wounds, but what I was really doing was staying familiar. Pain, after a while, becomes known territory. You learn its edges. You anticipate its triggers. You develop strategies around it. Lessons are different. Lessons don't ask you to stay close. They ask you to move forward carrying something new. That idea unsettled me at first. If something is a lesson, it means it's finished teaching. And if it's finished teaching, then I don't need to keep returning to it. I don't need to keep proving how deeply it affected me. I don't need to keep referencing it as an explanation for who I am now. That felt almost disloyal. To myself, to my younger self, to the seriousness of what I went through. But there's a difference between respect and attachment. Respect says, this mattered. Attachment says, this defines me. I began to see how often I reached for the language of wounds when I felt uncertain. How easily I explained hesitation by pointing to something unresolved. How often I used my past as context when what I really needed was courage in the present. I don't say this to minimize pain. Some experiences cut deeply. Some change the architecture of your inner world in ways that can't be undone. I don't believe in pretending otherwise. But I've learned that not every scar needs to be reopened in order to be honored. A lesson doesn't erase what happened. It reframes how it lives inside me. When I look back now, I can see moments where I stayed because I believed endurance was love. Moments where I left because I mistook self-preservation for failure. Moments where I ignored my intuition because it didn't align with what seemed reasonable at the time. If I call those wounds, I remain in reaction to them. I stay alert, guarded, cautious. If I call them lessons, something shifts. A lesson says, now I know what endurance costs. A lesson says, now I recognize when preservation is wisdom. A lesson says, now I trust the signal that speaks quietly but consistently. Lessons don't ask me to relive. They ask me to apply. When this distinction matters because it determines where my attention goes. Wounds pull attention backward. Lessons orient attention forward. I noticed that when I thought of myself as wounded, I expected life to accommodate me gently. I was watchful. I waited for reassurance. I hesitated to initiate. When I thought of myself as someone who had learned, I stood differently. I didn't need guarantees. I didn't need constant confirmation. I didn't need to explain myself as much. Lessons create a different posture. They don't make me invulnerable. They make me informed. And informed women move differently. I stopped asking, why did this happen to me? I started asking, what did this teach me about my thresholds? I stopped asking, what did I lose? I started asking, what capacity did this develop? Those questions don't romanticize pain, and they contextualize it. There's also something deeply liberating about no longer needing my suffering to validate my depth. I don't have to keep proving that something was hard in order for it to have mattered. I don't have to rehearse my pain to justify my boundaries or my choices. The lesson is already embedded. I carry it in how quickly I recognize misalignment, in how clearly I sense when something is off, in how much less tolerance I have for environments that require me to disappear. That clarity didn't come from reading about growth. It came from living. Calling something a lesson doesn't mean I'm finished processing it emotionally. It means I'm no longer letting it dictate my identity. It means I'm no longer organizing my future around my past. There's a quiet dignity in that. I've also learned that lessons don't always feel empowering at first. Sometimes they feel disappointing. Sometimes they come with the realization that I participated in dynamics I wish I hadn't, that I ignored signs, that I stayed silent when speaking up might have changed things. Calling those moments lessons doesn't absolve me. It matures me. It allows me to hold complexity without collapsing into self-blame. A wound says, be careful, you could get hurt again. A lesson says, you know what to look for now. That difference is subtle, but it's everything. I don't need to harden myself to avoid pain. I need to trust what I've learned about myself, about others, about the cost of misalignment. When I stopped centering my story around wounds, I noticed how much energy became available. Energy that had been spent protecting, managing, anticipating. That energy returned to me as presence. I'm not healed in the way people like to talk about healing. I'm not untouched by what I've lived, but I am informed. I am aware. I am less confused by my own responses. And that awareness is not heavy. It's grounding. The difference between a wound and a lesson is the difference between carrying something and being shaped by it. One keeps you tethered. The other lets you move. I'm choosing to move, not away from my past, but forward with it integrated, not erased, not minimized, just understood. And that understanding doesn't hurt the way I thought it would. It steadies me. It reminds me that I am not a collection of injuries waiting to be protected, but a woman who has lived, learned, and now knows how to stand inside her own experience without flinching. That shift alone changes how the future feels, not lighter, but clearer. And clarity, I'm learning, is a form of freedom. The anger I never admitted out loud there is an anger I learned how to hide so well that even I forgot it was there. Not the explosive kind, not the kind that raises its voice or breaks things. This anger is quieter than that, more disciplined. It learned early how to dress itself up as composure, maturity, perspective. It learned how to stay seated at the table and wait its turn, knowing it might never be called on. I didn't admit it out loud because I didn't have language for it that felt acceptable. Anger, especially for women like me, is rarely welcomed unless it's tidy and justified, unless it has a clear villain, unless it can be translated into something productive. My anger didn't cooperate like that. It wasn't aimed cleanly at one person or one event. It was diffuse, directionless. It surfaced in moments when effort didn't lead to outcome, when doing everything right still ended in loss, when patience didn't protect me, When integrity didn't guarantee safety, I didn't know where to put that kind of anger, so I put it away. I told myself I was being reasonable, that this was just how life worked, that disappointment was immature, that wanting fairness was naive. I reframed and reframed until my anger sounded like acceptance. But acceptance that requires silence isn't acceptance. It's suppression with good posture. What I never said out loud was how angry I was at the way things unfolded despite my care. How angry I was that restraint didn't spare me. How angry I was that being thoughtful, generous, and conscientious didn't earn the protection I subconsciously believed it should. I didn't feel entitled to that anger. Somewhere along the way, I absorbed the idea that anger meant ingratitude, that if I named it, I was failing to appreciate what I still had. So I swallowed it. I intellectualized it. I spiritualized it. I reframed it as growth, as redirection, as timing. All of those interpretations may have been true, but they weren't honest, because underneath them was a quieter truth. I was angry that life didn't keep its side of the bargain I didn't realize I'd made. I had believed, without ever articulating it, that if I showed up with enough integrity, enough effort, enough restraint, things would make sense. That outcomes would align with intention. That sacrifice would be seen. When that didn't happen, I didn't rage. I withdrew. That's what unexpressed anger often does. It doesn't explode outward. It turns inward and becomes distance. Distance from desire, distance from hope, distance from risk. I noticed it in how I approached new opportunities with caution instead of curiosity, in how I held back excitement until something was confirmed, in how I managed expectations so thoroughly that surprise became rare. Anger I never admitted out loud became vigilance. There was also anger toward timing, toward the years that felt wasted waiting for clarity that never came, toward the seasons when I was ready but circumstances weren't, toward the realization that effort doesn't accelerate everything. That anger felt particularly shameful because it wasn't directed at anyone. You can't confront timing. You can't argue with life. So I did what many women do. I minimized it. And I told myself other people had it worse. I told myself this was just adulthood. I told myself to be grateful. Gratitude became a way to silence myself. What I didn't realize was that anger doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It just changes form. It shows up as impatience, as cynicism, as fatigue that doesn't lift with rest. It clouds intuition. I found myself second-guessing decisions that used to feel clear, overthinking simple choices, hesitating where I once moved decisively. Anger, when it's unacknowledged, interrupts trust, especially trust in oneself. There was also anger toward the versions of myself who didn't speak sooner, who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who tolerated discomfort longer than necessary. That anger was the hardest to face because it felt dangerously close to blame. But blame wasn't what I felt. I felt grief. Grief for the energy I spent being reasonable when I was actually hurt. Grief for the moments I didn't allow myself to fully feel because I didn't want to become bitter or difficult. Naming that anger didn't turn me against myself. It softened something. I began to see that my anger wasn't evidence of failure. It was evidence of care, of investment, of values. I was angry because I had believed in something, in fairness, in reciprocity, in meaning. Anger, I realized, is not the opposite of peace. It's the body's signal that something mattered and didn't land the way it should have. The problem wasn't the anger. The problem was that I never let it complete its message. I didn't need to act on it. I didn't need to direct it at anyone. I needed to listen to it. When I finally allowed myself to acknowledge it, quietly and privately, It didn't overwhelm me. It clarified me. It helped me see where my boundaries had been crossed, not dramatically, but incrementally. Where my expectations had been unrealistic, not because I was foolish, but because I was hopeful. Where I had given more than I could sustain, believing it would be met. That awareness didn't make me hardened. It made me more precise. I stopped confusing acceptance with passivity. I stopped calling resignation wisdom. I stopped pretending that disappointment didn't deserve to be felt. There is a particular kind of peace that comes after anger is acknowledged, not resolved, not justified, just named. It's not relief, it's alignment. I no longer need to carry anger as tension in my body or distance in my relationships. I can let it be what it is, information. Information about what I value. Information about where I've outgrown certain beliefs. Information about how I want to live going forward. I don't raise my voice now. I don't dramatize my anger, but I don't erase it either. I let it pass through me instead of lodging itself inside me. That has changed how I listen to myself, how I respond to frustration, how I trust my instincts again. The anger I never admitted out loud was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a signal. And once I stopped silencing it, I found something underneath that surprised me. Not bitterness, clarity, a steadier sense of where I stand, of what I will and won't accept, of how I want to move through the rest of my life, not armored, not resigned, but awake. Anger, when it's finally given a voice, doesn't destroy peace. It makes room for a deeper one that isn't built on silence, but on truth. Why I'm more afraid of my power than my pain for a long time, I believed pain was the hardest thing I had to face. Pain had shape, history, a narrative I could explain. I knew where it came from, even when I didn't fully understand why it stayed. Pain made sense in a world that teaches women how to endure. There were scripts for it, sympathy for it, even a strange kind of belonging in it. Power, on the other hand, felt far more dangerous. I didn't recognize this at first. I thought I was cautious, thoughtful, measured. I told myself I was taking my time, being realistic, waiting for the right conditions. But underneath those explanations was something quieter and more unsettling. I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped living from my pain and started living from my power. Pain keeps expectations low. It gives you context. It explains hesitation. It makes restraint look like wisdom. When you live from pain, people understand your boundaries. They accept your limits. They don't ask too much of you. Power does the opposite. Power changes the atmosphere. It disrupts dynamics that have been carefully balanced around who you've been. It requires decisions that don't come with consensus. It asks you to stand in rooms without apologizing for the space you take up. Pain, I could manage. Power demanded something else entirely. I noticed this fear in small moments. When I felt a clear internal yes and talked myself into waiting. When I sensed an ending approaching and extended it anyway. When opportunities appeared and I immediately calculated what they would cost others before asking what they might give me. Pain had taught me how to be careful. Power was asking me to be honest. That honesty felt risky. Because power doesn't just change your relationship with yourself. It changes your relationship with everyone around you. I had grown accustomed to being the one who adapts, the one who understands, the one who absorbs. My pain fit neatly into that role. It justified my flexibility, my patience, my willingness to compromise. Power threatened it. If I lived from my power, I would have to say things that couldn't be softened. I would have to make choices that didn't come with explanations. I would have to tolerate being misunderstood without rushing to clarify. Pain kept me relatable. Power risked making me inconvenient. There's also the quiet fear that power exposes you to loss in a different way. When you act from pain, disappointment feels familiar. When you act from power, disappointment can feel sharper because you showed up fully, because you didn't hedge, because you didn't leave yourself an exit strategy. I realized that part of me preferred the predictability of pain to the uncertainty of expansion. Pain asks very little of your imagination. Power asks you to envision a life that doesn't rely on endurance as its primary virtue. And that's destabilizing when endurance has been your identity. I also had to confront the way power disrupts internal narratives. For years, I told myself stories about why things hadn't happened yet, why certain doors remained closed, why certain desires stayed unfulfilled. Those stories were comforting. They explained delay. They protected hope by postponing it. Power doesn't wait for stories to catch up. Power asks, "What if the delay is no longer necessary?" Power asks, "What if you're ready now?" That question scared me more than I expected, because if I was ready, then I couldn't keep blaming timing, or circumstances, or the slow accumulation of healing. I would have to accept responsibility for choosing. Choosing means risking change, and change means letting go of the version of myself who survived so much by staying small in precise, socially acceptable ways. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with stepping into power. It's the grief of outgrowing familiar limitations, of releasing the stories that once kept you safe, of acknowledging that some forms of pain are no longer relevant and therefore no longer protective. I didn't want to betray the woman I had been, the woman who endured, the woman who learned how to live inside constraint. But power didn't ask me to reject her. It asked me to stop letting her run my life. Pain keeps you anchored to the past. Power reorients you toward the present. That shift feels abrupt, even when it's gradual. I noticed how often I delayed decisions under the guise of thoughtfulness, how often I sought more information when I already knew enough, how often I framed my hesitation as care for others when it was actually fear of standing alone. Power requires a tolerance for solitude, not isolation, but the willingness to stand in your own knowing without immediate reinforcement. Pain had taught me how to seek validation. Power asked me to generate it internally. That was unfamiliar terrain. I also had to reckon with the fact that power would make some people uncomfortable, not because I would become unkind or domineering, but because clarity disrupts ambiguity. Boundaries shift dynamics. Presence changes expectations. I couldn't predict who would adjust and who wouldn't, and I couldn't control how my growth would be interpreted. Pain had taught me how to remain agreeable. Power asked me to be aligned. Alignment doesn't negotiate with comfort. It doesn't rush to reassure. It doesn't dilute itself to stay welcome. It holds its shape, even when that shape is unfamiliar to others. That scared me, because I had learned to equate harmony with safety. I had learned to smooth edges, to anticipate reactions, to stay within relational contracts I never consciously signed. Power threatened those contracts. It asked me to risk being seen as different, not better, not superior, just no longer willing to contort myself to fit expectations that had gone unquestioned for years. And yet, despite the fear, I could feel something else underneath it. Relief. Relief at the thought of no longer organizing my life around pain management. Relief at the possibility of choosing from desire instead of damage control. Relief at the idea of moving forward without dragging old justifications behind me. Power, I realized, wasn't loud or forceful. It was quiet, steady, uncompromising in a way that didn't require explanation. It didn't ask me to become someone else. It asked me to stop hiding from myself. I am still learning how to tolerate my own power, how to let it be present without rushing to temper it, how to trust that I can hold what comes next without shrinking to preempt discomfort. Pain taught me how to survive. Power is teaching me how to live without apology. And that transition is not dramatic. It's subtle. It shows up in choices that don't announce themselves, in moments where I act without overthinking, in decisions that feel calm instead of charged. I am no longer afraid of pain. I understand it. I respect it. But I am learning to stop using it as a shield against my own expansion. Because the truth is, pain may have shaped me, but power is what will carry me forward. And the more I allow myself to stand in it, the less I need to explain why I ever waited at all. The warrior and the soldier, living inside me. For a long time, I thought there was only one way to move through my life. Stay alert, stay ready, stay responsive. I didn't question it. It felt natural, even necessary. I told myself this was maturity, responsibility. What I didn't realize was that I was living almost entirely from one part of myself, the part that knows how to react, comply, endure. The soldier. The soldier in me learned early how to survive environments that didn't pause for feelings. She learned how to assess quickly, adjust constantly, and stay useful. She is efficient. She is vigilant. She knows how to follow orders that were never spoken out loud. She senses expectations before they're voiced and meets them before anyone has to ask. The soldier is not weak. She is disciplined. She has kept me functioning in moments when stopping wasn't an option. She knows how to get through the day, the week, the season. She understands duty. She understands sacrifice. She understands how to keep going even when the cost is personal. For a long time, I mistook her for my whole self. But somewhere along the way, I began to feel exhausted in a way that rest didn't fix. Not burned out, alerted. As if something in me was constantly bracing for impact, even when nothing was happening. I realized then that I wasn't tired from doing too much. I was tired from being on guard all the time. That's when I started to notice the other presence inside me, the warrior. She had been there all along, but she doesn't shout to be heard. She doesn't respond to urgency. She doesn't operate on constant readiness. The warrior is quieter, slower, more deliberate. She doesn't rush to engage every situation. She watches first. She discerns. Where the soldier reacts, the warrior chooses. The soldier fights because she's been told to. The warrior fights because it matters. This distinction changed everything for me. I began to see how many of my struggles weren't the result of external pressure, but of internal misalignment. I was deploying the soldier in situations that required the warrior. I was using endurance where strategy was needed, effort where clarity was required. The soldier sees life as a series of immediate demands. She moves from one task to the next, one conflict to the next, measuring success by how much she can carry, without dropping anything. She doesn't ask whether the battle is worth it, only whether she can survive it. The warrior asks different questions. Is this necessary? Is this mine to carry? What is the larger terrain here? The warrior understands that not every fight deserves engagement. That energy is finite. That preservation is not weakness. It is wisdom. And I realized how often I had been fighting battles that didn't belong to me. Arguments that weren't mine to resolve, expectations that weren't mine to fulfill, emotional labor that wasn't mine to provide. The soldier took pride in that. She felt valuable when she was needed. She felt secure when she was indispensable. The warrior doesn't need to be indispensable. She needs to be aligned. Alignment is quieter than usefulness. but far more powerful. Living from the soldier kept me busy. Living from the warrior asked me to become intentional. And intentional living is uncomfortable when you've been conditioned to respond rather than decide. The soldier waits for orders, explicit or implied. The warrior listens for inner instruction. That shift required me to trust myself in a way I hadn't before, to believe that my sense of timing and my discernment, my intuition were not liabilities to manage, but tools to rely on. I noticed how often the soldier stepped in out of habit. When something felt uncertain, she tightened. When conflict appeared, she prepared. When someone was disappointed, she mobilized. The warrior didn't interrupt her harshly. She didn't dismiss her. She simply asked, "Is this the right response for this moment?" Sometimes the answer was yes. The soldier still has a role. There are moments that require grit, follow-through, consistency. The warrior doesn't eliminate the soldier. She commands her. That was the missing piece. Without a warrior to lead, the soldier runs the entire operation. And when that happens, life becomes a series of skirmishes with no clear purpose. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels personal. Everything feels like it requires immediate action. I had been living that way for years without realizing it. The warrior brought perspective. She widened my view. She helped me see the difference between reacting to noise and responding to meaning. She taught me that battle is not the same as fighting. Fighting is emotional, reactive, close range. Battle is strategic, intentional, purpose-driven. I had been fighting my life instead of engaging it. The warrior doesn't waste energy proving strength. She doesn't need to show up everywhere. She understands that leadership of self, of life, means knowing when to step forward and when to step back. This changed how I handled conflict, how I made decisions, how I measured success. I stopped asking, "Can I handle this?" I started asking, "Should I?" That question alone reduced more exhaustion than any boundary I'd ever set. The soldier wants resolution. The warrior wants coherence. The soldier moves toward closure as quickly as possible. The warrior allows things to unfold until clarity emerges. This doesn't make the warrior passive. It makes her precise. I am still learning how to let the warrior lead. Old habits don't disappear overnight. The soldier has been running the show for a long time. She doesn't relinquish control easily. But now, when I feel that familiar tightening, that readiness to respond to everything at once, I pause. I check in. I ask which part of me is being activated. Is this survival speaking, or is this wisdom? The answer changes how I move. Living from the warrior doesn't make life easier in the short term. It makes it truer. It requires discernment instead of reflex, presence instead of performance, trust instead of constant preparedness. I no longer need to be on every front. I no longer need to fight for my worth through effort. I no longer need to prove strength by enduring everything silently. The soldier in me knows how to survive. The warrior in me knows what's worth surviving for. And as I learn to let the warrior lead, something unexpected happens. Life stops feeling like an endless series of demands. It starts to feel like a landscape, one I can move through with intention, clarity, and respect for my own limits. I am no longer just responding to what comes at me. I am choosing how I stand, and that choice changes everything. Feminine power that doesn't announce itself. For most of my life, I misunderstood power. I thought power announced itself. I thought it arrived loudly, took up space unapologetically, made decisions visible enough for others to recognize. I associated power with certainty, with authority, with the kind of confidence that doesn't waver or question itself. And because of that belief, I spent years overlooking the most natural form of power I possessed, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen. My feminine power has never been dramatic. It doesn't enter a room and rearrange the air. It doesn't need to dominate conversation or make its presence obvious. It operates quietly, often invisibly, and that made it easy to dismiss, especially in a world that confuses volume with influence. I learned early that being taken seriously often meant speaking quickly, defending ideas before they were challenged, justifying decisions in advance, and I learned how to sharpen my edges so I wouldn't be mistaken for someone passive or uncertain. And in doing that, I slowly distanced myself from the kind of power that works beneath the surface, the power that listens longer than it speaks, the power that waits for alignment instead of rushing for approval, the power that trusts what it senses before it can explain it. I didn't lose that power. I just stopped trusting it. There is something profoundly unsettling about feminine power when it's fully embodied, not because it's aggressive, but because it's not reactive. It doesn't perform certainty. It doesn't negotiate its worth. It doesn't chase validation. It simply knows. That knowing isn't intellectual. It's somatic. It lives in the body, in pauses, in intuition that arrives without evidence and asks to be honored anyway. For years, I overrode that knowing. I asked it to wait while I gathered facts, opinions, reassurance. I postponed decisions that felt clear because I couldn't yet defend them convincingly. I learned to distrust signals that didn't come with proof. But feminine power doesn't argue its case. It withdraws when ignored. And that withdrawal looks like confusion. I thought I was uncertain. I wasn't. I was disconnected from the part of me that recognizes truth quietly and immediately. When I began to pay attention again, it didn't feel empowering in the way I expected. It felt subtle, almost anticlimactic, like remembering something I already knew rather than discovering something new. I noticed how often clarity came to me not when I was thinking, but when I was still. Not when I was explaining, but when I was listening. Not when I was pushing forward, but when I stopped interfering. This kind of power doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need permission. It doesn't need consensus. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to convince. It shows up as restraint, as the decision not to respond immediately, as the choice to walk away without justification, as the ability to sit with ambiguity without rushing to resolve it. These moments don't look powerful from the outside. They look like nothing. And yet, they are the moments where everything inside me aligns. Feminine power is deeply relational, not in the sense of accommodating others, but in the sense of being in relationship with reality. It notices undercurrents. It reads rooms. It senses shifts before they become obvious. I used to think that sensitivity was something to manage, something to toughen up against. I didn't realize it was a form of intelligence, the kind that doesn't dominate systems but understands them, the kind that doesn't confront head-on but reroutes energy quietly. I began to see how often my most grounded decisions were made, without fanfare, no inner debate, no external consultation, just a calm internal recognition. This is a yes, or this is a no. And once that recognition was there, action followed naturally. There was no drama in it. That was the hardest part to trust, because we've been taught that transformation should feel seismic, that power should feel exhilarating, that growth should come with fireworks. But feminine power feels like steadiness. It feels like not needing to check in with everyone before moving, like allowing silence to do the work words used to do, like letting things fall away without chasing explanation. It's the power to stop negotiating with what I already know. I also noticed how this power changed my relationship with conflict. I no longer needed to win arguments to feel secure. I didn't need to correct misunderstandings immediately. I could let people hold incomplete narratives about me without rushing to fill in the gaps. That was new. Before, I believed being misunderstood was dangerous. Now, I see it as inevitable when you stop performing. Feminine power doesn't try to control perception. It focuses on coherence, on being internally aligned even when external reactions vary. This power doesn't rush toward resolution. It understands that some things need time, space, and quiet to reveal themselves. It allows life to unfold without constant interference. And that doesn't mean passivity. It means discernment, knowing when to act and when not to, knowing when to speak and when silence carries more weight, knowing when effort is necessary and when it's just noise. There is also a tenderness to this power that I once mistook for fragility. It feels deeply. It responds emotionally. It registers impact. But that sensitivity doesn't weaken it. It refines it. Because when you feel deeply, you choose carefully. You don't waste energy on what doesn't matter. You don't invest in dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. You don't overextend just to prove capacity. Feminine power is economical. It conserves energy. It respects limits. It prioritizes sustainability over intensity. This is not the power of force. It's the power of presence. And presence doesn't announce itself. It's felt. And it's felt when I walk away from something that once consumed me and don't look back. When I say less and mean more. When I trust myself enough to wait without anxiety. I no longer confuse loudness with strength. I no longer equate control with authority. The most powerful moments in my life now are often invisible to others. They happen internally, in decisions I don't explain, in boundaries I don't dramatize, in clarity I don't advertise. This kind of power doesn't seek to be recognized because recognition would make it external again. It belongs inside, and the more I allow it to lead, the less I need to prove anything at all. I'm learning that my quietness is not an absence of power. It is the source of it. Letting go of the small fights that drain me. For a long time, I believed that engagement was a form of responsibility. If something felt off, I addressed it. If someone misunderstood me, I clarified. If a situation felt unfair, I explained my position. Carefully, thoroughly, with evidence. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was what emotionally intelligent women did. We didn't let things fester. We handled them. We communicated. What I didn't realize was how much energy I was bleeding through constant participation, not in the big moments, in the small ones. The passing comment that didn't quite land right. The subtle shift in tone that invited interpretation. The mild tension I felt obligated to smooth over. None of these moments were dramatic enough to justify exhaustion on their own, but together they formed a pattern. I was living in a state of low-level engagement with things that didn't actually matter. I didn't see them as fights at first. That word felt too strong. These were discussions, clarifications, necessary conversations. But my body knew better. My shoulders tightened before I even decided to respond. My jaw clenched when I reread messages I didn't need to reread. My mind rehearsed explanations no one had asked for yet. That's how I knew. Anything that drains you before it even begins is not a conversation. It's a fight. I had become very skilled at fighting politely. I fought for understanding. I fought for fairness. I fought for context. And because I wasn't raising my voice or slamming doors, I told myself it wasn't costing me much. It was. The energy I spent managing perceptions was energy I wasn't spending living. I was constantly adjusting tone, timing, wording, trying to ensure that nothing escalated, nothing broke, nothing became uncomfortable. But discomfort was already there. It just lived inside me instead of out in the open. Letting go of small fights didn't happen all at once. It started with a realization that surprised me. Not every moment of friction requires resolution. Some moments just require distance. I had to question a belief I'd carried for years, that silence equals avoidance, that walking away means losing, that not responding is somehow irresponsible. What I'm learning now is that discernment looks a lot like restraint. There's a difference between avoiding conflict and refusing unnecessary engagement. Avoidance is fear-based. Refusal is clarity-based. I began to notice how often I entered conversations already braced, already preparing to justify myself. How often I felt compelled to defend choices that didn't actually need defending. How often I felt responsible for managing other people's reactions to my boundaries. That responsibility was self-assigned. No one asked me to do that work. I volunteered, and the cost of that volunteerism was subtle but persistent fatigue. The kind that doesn't go away with rest because it's not physical, it's emotional vigilance. I was constantly scanning for what might need to be addressed next. Letting go of small fights meant letting go of that scanning. It meant accepting that some misunderstandings will remain misunderstandings. Some people will be disappointed. Some dynamics will shift without explanation, and the world will not end. This was harder than I expected, because small fights often masquerade as values. We tell ourselves we're standing up for something important. We confuse engagement with integrity. We believe that if we don't speak, something essential will be lost. Sometimes that's true. Often it's not. I had to learn how to ask a different question. Not is this right, but is this worth my energy? That question changed everything, because many of the things I was fighting over weren't actually central to my life. They were peripheral, habitual, inherited from a version of myself that believed being understood was necessary for being okay. I no longer believe that. Understanding is not a prerequisite for peace. I noticed how much quieter my life became when I stopped attending every emotional invitation, when I let texts sit unanswered if responding would require me to over-explain, when I didn't correct every assumption or clarify every nuance. At first, this felt irresponsible, then it felt uncomfortable, and then, unexpectedly, it felt clean. Clean in the way a room feels after you remove furniture you've been navigating around for years. I wasn't avoiding truth. I was choosing alignment. Small fights drain you because they fragment your attention. They pull you out of yourself and into narratives that don't serve your life. They demand energy without offering growth. Big fights, real ones, have weight. They shape you. They require courage. Small fights just consume you. Letting them go freed up space I didn't realize I was missing. Space to think without interruption. Space to feel without explanation. Space to respond instead of react. I also had to grieve something in this process. The version of me who believed that being engaged meant being connected. Connection doesn't require constant negotiation. It requires presence. And presence is impossible when you're always preparing your next defense. I'm learning to recognize the early signs now, the tightening, the rehearsing, the urge to step in and manage. When I feel that, I pause. I ask myself, if I don't engage, what actually happens? Most of the time, the answer is simple. Nothing. The situation resolves itself, or it fades, or it reveals itself more clearly without my interference, and in the rare cases where something truly needs my voice, I can feel the difference. There's less tension, more steadiness, a sense of purpose rather than obligation. Letting go of small fights doesn't mean I've stopped caring. It means I've become more selective about what I care with my energy. There is a kind of confidence that comes from not needing to respond to everything. A quiet authority in choosing when to speak and when silence is sufficient. I don't need to win every moment to be at peace. I don't need to be right to be whole. I don't need to be understood to be settled inside myself. This doesn't make me detached. It makes me anchored. I am no longer fighting to maintain equilibrium. I am protecting it. And that protection isn't aggressive. It's gentle. It's firm. It's consistent. The small fights didn't disappear on their own. I had to stop feeding them. And once I did, I realized how much life opens up when you're no longer drained by things that were never meant to matter in the first place. What remains is not silence, it's clarity. And clarity is far more sustaining than constant engagement ever was. What legacy really means at this stage of life for most of my life. A legacy sounded like something distant, something you think about when you're older, when the work is done, when there's time to look back and summarize what mattered. Legacy felt like an ending word, a word reserved for resumes, obituaries, achievements that could be listed and measured. At this stage of my life, that definition no longer fits. I'm not interested in being remembered for how much I accomplished or how much I endured. I'm not motivated by the idea of being impressive in hindsight. What I'm beginning to understand is that legacy isn't something I leave behind someday. It's something I live inside of now. Legacy used to feel external to me, something built through milestones, career, stability, contribution, proof that my life added up to something coherent. But somewhere along the way, that narrative stopped feeling true. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. I've done enough, seen enough, lived long enough to know that what shapes people most is not what we say about our lives, but how it feels to be around us while we're living them. Legacy is not what I produce. It's the atmosphere I create. At this stage, I'm far more aware of tone than outcome, of impact over intention, of what remains in a room after I leave it, not materially, but emotionally. Do people feel more at ease with themselves after spending time with me? Do they feel pressured to perform or permitted to exhale? Do they feel seen or evaluated? These questions matter more to me now than metrics ever did. I've realized that legacy is an emotional inheritance. It's the way my presence teaches others, quietly, what is possible, permissible, or expected. And it's what I model without meaning to. The way I treat myself becomes a reference point for others, whether I acknowledge that responsibility or not. That realization changed how I think about healing. Healing is no longer a private project. It's relational. It ripples outward. The work I do internally affects how safe others feel to be honest, how much permission they give themselves to rest, to question, to change. I used to think legacy was about leaving something behind. Now I see it's about not passing certain things forward. Not passing forward chronic self-neglect disguised as strength, not passing forward silence mistaken for peace, not passing forward the belief that love requires self-erasure. Those patterns don't need to be inherited at this stage of life, and I'm much less interested in being admired and far more interested in being congruent, in being the same woman in private that I am in public. In not outsourcing my values to whatever environment I'm in. That kind of consistency is quiet. It doesn't draw attention, but it lasts. I've also had to grieve an older version of legacy I once chased, The idea that my life needed to make sense in a linear way, that every choice should build cleanly on the last, that detours were inefficiencies rather than information. Now I see those detours differently. They taught me discernment. They taught me humility. They taught me how to listen to what doesn't announce itself loudly. Those lessons don't show up on paper, but they live in how I respond to complexity, how I tolerate uncertainty, how I hold space without trying to control it. Legacy, how for me now, is about the quality of my attention. What do I give my attention to? What do I withdraw it from? What do I linger with? And what do I allow to pass without attachment? These choices shape a life more deeply than ambition ever did. I've noticed that the women I respect most at this stage are not the loudest or the most accomplished. They are the most settled. There's something in their presence that doesn't rush, doesn't perform, doesn't seek confirmation. They don't need to convince you of who they are. You feel it. That's the kind of legacy I'm drawn to now. Not a name etched into something permanent, but a nervous system that has learned how to regulate itself. A life that doesn't need constant reinforcement to feel legitimate. A way of being that makes room for others without losing itself. But I'm also more aware now of what I don't want my legacy to be. I don't want to be remembered as someone who was always busy, but rarely present. I don't want to be known for endurance without joy. I don't want my life to communicate that exhaustion is the cost of meaning. Meaning doesn't require depletion. At this stage, legacy is about sustainability, about choosing rhythms I can live with, not just survive, about creating a life that doesn't depend on crisis to feel purposeful. I'm no longer interested in proving that I can carry more. I'm interested in learning how to carry what matters well. That shift has softened something in me. It's made me less reactive, less defensive, less invested in external validation. Not because I've transcended those needs, but because they no longer drive me. I don't need my life to impress anyone. I need it to feel honest. And honesty, I'm learning, leaves a deeper mark than achievement ever could. Legacy, at this stage, is how I show up when no one is watching. It's how I treat my own inner life. It's the permission I give myself to be unfinished, to change my mind, to rest without apology. Those permissions don't end with me. They travel. They travel to the people who know me well enough to sense the shift. They travel to the women watching quietly, taking notes. Not on what I say, but on how I live. They travel through tone, through pacing, through what I choose not to dramatize. I may never know exactly who is affected by that, and that's fine. Legacy doesn't require witnesses. It requires integrity. At this stage of life, that's what I'm committed to, not building something that lasts forever, but living in a way that doesn't fracture me along the way. If anything remains of me in the lives I touch, I hope it's this, a sense that it's possible to live with depth without heaviness, to carry wisdom without bitterness, to age into clarity rather than resignation. That's the legacy that feels true now, not something I'll leave behind someday, something I'm choosing, quietly, every day. Standing in the middle. Without rushing to the end, I used to believe that the middle was something to escape. The middle felt like suspension, like waiting without instructions, like being between versions of myself with no clear signal about which direction to move next. In a culture that worships beginnings and celebrates endings, the middle is treated like a problem to solve, an uncomfortable pause you're supposed to hurry through. For a long time, I did exactly that. Whenever I sensed myself in between, no longer who I was, not yet who I might become, I rushed. I looked for clarity. I looked for resolution. I looked for language that would make the uncertainty feel productive. anything to avoid sitting still inside the ambiguity. But something has changed. I no longer experience the middle as failure or delay. I experience it as truth. The middle is where the noise dies down, where the old identities loosen their grip, but the new ones haven't hardened yet. It's where there's nothing to prove, because nothing has fully formed, and that lack of form, once terrifying, has become strangely honest. I am not rushing toward an ending anymore. I am standing here. Standing in the middle means I don't get the relief of arrival or the adrenaline of beginning. There's no applause here. Was no dramatic turning point. Just the quiet reality of being alive inside an unfinished story. And for the first time, I'm not trying to edit that reality into something more impressive. The urge to rush comes from discomfort, not wisdom. It comes from the belief that clarity is safer than uncertainty, that answers are more valuable than questions. I lived under that belief for years. It kept me moving, but it didn't always keep me aligned. Now, I can feel the difference between movement that comes from fear and movement that comes from readiness. Fear-driven movement is urgent. It's tight. It demands immediate resolution. It doesn't trust the process. It tries to control it. Readiness is quieter. It waits. It listens. It doesn't force coherence before it naturally emerges. And standing in the middle requires a kind of courage that doesn't get much attention. It's the courage to let things be incomplete, to resist the pressure to summarize your life while you're still living it, to accept that some seasons are meant to be inhabited, not explained. I used to believe that if I paused too long, I would fall behind. That indecision was dangerous. That momentum mattered more than accuracy. But accuracy, inner accuracy, has become more important to me than speed. In the middle, I am not optimizing myself. I am not reinventing myself. I am not discarding my past or auditioning for a future version of me. I am integrating. That process doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly beneath the surface. Old beliefs loosen. New values take shape. Priorities reorder themselves without asking permission. From the outside, and it may look like nothing is happening. From the inside, everything is. Standing in the middle means I am no longer using urgency as a substitute for trust. I trust that clarity doesn't need to be chased. It needs to be allowed. I trust that what is meant to emerge will do so when there is enough space for it. This doesn't mean I'm passive. It means I'm present. Presence is different from waiting. Waiting implies delay. Presence implies participation, just not the kind that forces outcomes. I am participating by paying attention, by noticing what feels lighter and what feels heavy, by honoring what no longer fits without demanding an immediate replacement. There is grief in this stage, even if it doesn't look like grief. Grief for identities that carried me for a long time, for goals that once made sense, for narratives that no longer hold. And I let that grief exist without turning it into a problem to fix. There is also relief here. Relief in not having to perform certainty. Relief in not needing to declare a direction before I feel it in my body. Relief in letting my life breathe instead of constantly structuring it. Standing in the middle has taught me that not all movement is visible. Some of the most important shifts happen internally, where no one else can measure them. I don't need to rush to the end of this story to make it legitimate. I don't need to tie everything together neatly. Life is not an argument that needs a conclusion. It's a process that needs honesty. I am honest now about what I don't know, about what I'm no longer willing to force, about what I'm still listening for. That honesty has softened me, not into fragility, but into truth. I am not broken. I am not late. I am not behind. Those thoughts used to circle me whenever I couldn't explain my direction. Now, they pass through without sticking. The middle is not a holding pattern. It's a living space. It's where intuition gets clearer because there's less noise, where choices become simpler because they're rooted in alignment rather than expectation, where I stop asking, "What should I be doing?" and start asking, "What feels true right now?" That question doesn't rush me. It grounds me. I don't know exactly what comes next, and I'm no longer alarmed by that. I've lived long enough to know that clarity often arrives quietly, after patience has done its work. Standing in the middle has also changed how I relate to time. I'm less obsessed with timelines, less preoccupied with milestones. I'm more interested in pacing, in sustainability, in whether the life I'm building is one I can actually inhabit. I don't need to arrive anywhere to be valid. I don't need an ending to justify the journey. I don't need to explain the middle to anyone else for it to matter. This is where honesty begins. Not at the finish line, not at the breakthrough, but here, in the unresolved, in the unnamed, in the spaces between certainty and change. I stand here without rushing because rushing would pull me out of myself. And I've worked too hard to come back to abandon this moment now. The middle is not empty. It is full of information if I'm willing to listen, full of quiet signals if I'm willing to slow down, full of truth if I'm willing to stay. So I stay, not because I'm stuck, but because this is where my life is speaking most clearly. And this time, and I'm non, as I look back on this entire journey, I don't see a dramatic transformation. I don't see a woman who was lost and suddenly found. What I see instead is a long, quiet unraveling of false urgency, a gradual return to myself after years of moving forward without checking whether I was still aligned with my own life. This story was never about fixing what was broken. It was about recognizing what had been carrying too much weight for too long. I began as a woman who functioned well, who performed strength convincingly, who learned how to survive by staying composed. I mistook endurance for maturity. I mistook usefulness for worth. Over time, that confusion hollowed something out inside me. Not enough to collapse, but enough to feel disconnected from my own inner life. I learned how to forgive myself, not for dramatic failures, but for quieter things, for staying when I should have listened, for leaving when fear disguised itself as logic, for judging past versions of myself with information they didn't yet have. I learned that anger doesn't make me ungrateful, it makes me honest. That power isn't loud, it's steady. That not every battle deserves my energy, and not every explanation is required. I stopped seeing myself as wounded and began to see myself as informed. I stopped living like a soldier, reacting to every demand, and began listening for the quieter voice of the warrior, discerning, intentional, grounded. I reclaimed a feminine power that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't rush, that doesn't need permission to be real. And eventually, I arrived here, the middle, not a failure, not a delay, not a problem to solve. The middle is where old identities loosen and new ones haven't hardened yet. It's where clarity is forming beneath the surface. It's where life asks for honesty instead of answers. The deepest lesson in this story is simple, but not easy. You don't need to rush your becoming. You don't need to force closure. You don't need to explain your evolution. You don't need to be ahead of yourself to be valid. For those listening, the application isn't about doing more. It's about doing less, but with more truth. Pause before reacting. Notice where you're fighting out of habit, not necessity. Ask yourself whether your strength is protecting you or concealing you. Listen for the quiet signals you've been overriding, and allow yourself to stand in the middle, without demanding that it justify itself. Because the middle isn't empty. It's where integration happens. It's where wisdom settles. It's where you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of momentum. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before we end, here's a quick question for you. When you feel uncertain in your life right now, what do you tend to do first? A. I try to fix it quickly or push myself toward clarity. B. I pause and sit with it, even if it feels uncomfortable. Comment A or B below. I'm curious which one resonates with you. And if you feel comfortable, share your perspective in the comments. What does the middle look like in your life right now? How do you usually respond to it? Let's create a space where women don't have to rush their truth. If this conversation spoke to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep this kind of quiet and honest storytelling alive, and gives me the motivation to continue creating content for women who are doing fine but feel quietly lost. I'll see you next time.